Changing tides. As climate change moves forward, progress against poverty is pulled back. So what must we do for each other and for our world? When there's no rain, like now, we face big challenges. There are no yields. And when you go to the shops, you find that food prices have gone up, yet you are still jobless. These are the words of Simon, a farmer in a drought-stricken Kenya. His words illustrate the intersection of climate change and poverty, wherein the worst impacts are on those already struggling, an inequity known as the climate gap. Despite decades of progress towards reducing poverty worldwide, climate change has greatly contributed to turning the tide back. By the World Bank's most recent estimates, its effects will pull millions more into extreme poverty, up to 132 million by 2030. These realities are not some faraway future concern where most of us imagine events like the slowly rising sea level to start affecting people. Rather, this prediction is based on current and past evidence of its impact. Climate-based stressors are an ongoing obstacle in eradicating poverty, which are increasingly exacerbated by global warming. Increasing temperatures detrimentally impact daily living conditions, including access to food and clean drinking water. Decreasing supply of such necessities while demand remains unchanged or even grows results in heightened tensions in areas of conflict. The consequent violence here has started to force people out of their homes. Also exacerbated by climate change, natural disasters contribute to the refugee crisis too, by destroying assets, livelihoods, and ultimately pulling people into poverty or otherwise worsening their situation. Concerns often arise over ways that reducing climate change might make conditions worse for people living in poverty. However, there are options which work positively towards both, reducing poverty and reversing climate change. In particular, if efforts are made by wealthier nations worldwide, the clock does not have to turn back on the problem of poverty. Understanding how climate change not only affects everybody, but also causes and exacerbates poverty through existing inequalities, and especially considering the interdependence of all people on each other and on this earth we share, actions addressing both poverty and climate change must be made now in order to move forward. Climate change threatens progress made in the world, especially in regard to reducing poverty and its corollaries like hunger. According to the United Nations report on the state of food security and nutrition, after decades of steady decline, the trend in world hunger, as measured by the prevalence of undernourishment, reverted in 2015. In addition to their annual report named Building Climate Resilience for Food Security and Nutrition, they explain why. The gains made in ending hunger and nutrition are being eroded by climate variability and extremes. Many argue that advancing technology is enough to reverse this and keep up with the needs of food production. To their point, modern means of fertilizing land and increasing potential crop yields by magnitudes has helped significantly. Additionally, the same increasing carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming makes it more available in the atmosphere for plants to take in, utilize, and grow. But despite all this that points towards better cultivating conditions, the data still tells us that the cumulative effects of climate change have decreased agricultural productivity worldwide. Yields are calculated to be significantly lower than they would have been without warming, and ultimately increased food prices by an approximate 6.4% according to Nature. This has far-reaching effects, making food less affordable for people everywhere, including Simon, whose quote preceded this paper, living in Kenya, as well as for people living in the US, where even for a number of families who receive support from nutritional programs like SNAP and WIC, the additional resources are still inadequate to end their food insecurity. While social programs help people in need, cost increases due to global warming makes their efforts less impactful. Furthermore, failures to provide such basic needs go beyond the present moment, affecting one's health for years to come. Food insecurity is worst on children, whose development greatly suffers, putting them cognitively, emotionally, and physically behind their peers. In many countries, buying food takes up a large majority of the poor household's budget, even upwards of 80%. So, for struggling families across the globe, climate change is a contributor to food being too expensive for them to afford. And in a future where global supply loss could amount to 30% by 2080, with demand already doubling by 2050, this will soon be a universal problem. But already now, negative effects on the Earth's land and resources are even more direct for some than an increased hardship in buying food. Climate change threatens livelihoods by destroying agricultural land and correlating jobs, as well as puts countless assets at risk. Its exacerbation of natural hazards and disasters exemplify the climate gap, the disproportionate and unequal impact the climate crisis has on people of color and the poor. Given that such groups are already disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards in regard to pollution or lack of environmental amenities, exacerbations caused by climate change are both in the hazard itself and in the inequalities through which it is experienced. The degree to which social determinants of health are magnified is constantly increasing. As a current example, consider how African Americans in Los Angeles are twice as likely to die from a heat wave than others. And according to the United Nations, the number of extreme events, including extreme heat, droughts, floods, and storms, has doubled since the early 1990s, with hundreds occurring annually and each affecting the employment in that area, especially for those working in agriculture. Here in the US, where racial discrimination already makes it more difficult for some to be hired in the first place, such changes are still predicted to dramatically reduce or shift job opportunities in sectors such as agriculture and tourism, which predominantly employ low-income Americans and people of color. Losing jobs means losing the ability to afford basic needs, which, as already established, many already struggle to do. Such instability and insufficiencies are part of what makes these populations more vulnerable to other climate shocks too, like natural disasters. In this precarious position, any impact on their asset or consumption level threatens subsistence and long-term prospects, and they have less resources to reduce risks or cope in the first place. Those on the edge of poverty are easily pulled in by such an event, and when one's original life cannot be restored, whether it is their home destroyed by disasters like hurricanes or displacement forced by environmental hazards like soil infertility from prolonged droughts, the unavoidable consequence is needing to find a new home. Especially when entire communities and their economies are destroyed, anyone who cannot afford to build a completely new life joins this group of climate refugees. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace, more than 1 billion people may face this difficult reality by 2050. Adding to this number, many are displaced by conflict arisen from the consequences of climate change, often forcing people out of their home country to rely on the international community for more than just aid, and solidifying the need for our world to come together in addressing the problem. The climate crisis brought on by the process of wealthy nations building themselves up also requires their cooperation in solving it. As the agricultural supply declines with ever-growing demand, its consequences spread and displace people along with those forced out by other disasters. Tens of millions of climate refugees are seeking homes outside their original country every year. In this way, we become ever closer and more intertwined in the World House, also known as our Earth, and as the name of a piece by Martin Luther King Jr., in which his words illustrate what has more and more clearly been our reality. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. We have specifically inherited a house or world built on the use of fossil fuels by wealthy countries. Today, still, the average person's consumption of oil and other resources is up to 30 times higher in rich countries compared to poor, setting up disadvantaged people to suffer for others' actions. This problem simultaneously demonstrates how all life is interrelated, foreshadows what is to come for all, and requires outside assistance to solve. In this family, it is time to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions and to recognize that we are inevitably our brother's keeper because we are our brother's brother. This becomes increasingly clear as our brother comes, quite literally, to knock on the door of other nations when forced from their own home country. Considering our interrelatedness, he wisely advises, nothing would be more disastrous and out of harmony with our self-interest than for the developed nations to travel a dead-end road of inordinate selfishness. Taking more steps which benefit the few over the many will inevitably increase the threat of climate change, so solutions must instead address poverty to promote progress for all. With how intertwined these problems are, a step towards solving one often works towards the other, like funding coastal restoration and reforestation projects, which protects those communities and creates economic opportunities. Establishing climate resilience with heat-resistant crops will serve both the farmers themselves and everyone who depends on the food they grow. Finally, according to the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, even just the US moving away from emissions towards clean energy will save trillions by 2030. With these solutions, we are confronted with the fierce urgency of now, to work together towards reducing poverty and reversing climate change, altogether strengthening our world house.